Hello, Crossing Church. How are you doing? Are you doing good today? It's great to see you. Hey, I was able to worship with you on Saturday night. Last week I was gone on Sunday. Did Clayton throw it down or what? I mean, it was awesome sermon. I'm just so thankful for that message, and really impacted my life. And I want to welcome everyone from Macomb. You haven't seen me for a while, and on Saturday night, that's been a struggle because of some video stuff, but I think we've gotten worked through that. I'm glad that you're joining us. I'm glad Hannibal's joining us in Kirksville. Graham, Wendy, how you doing? Glad that you're joining us. 929, Mount Sterling, Pittsfield. Who am I missing? Hannibal, you guys are awesome. Lima, you guys rock. Hey, Mount Sterling has been averaging over 200. They're like going nuts. It's awesome, you know. And I think last week we saw our first baptism for Mount Sterling that was as part of the crossing, and that's awesome, just awesome. And I was here in Pittsfield. Clint was talking about how this weekend, I think they're baptizing 8 in their cattle feeder tank, you know. And it's like, God is just moving in incredible ways, and I'm just so thankful for that, to be a part of that, and just to be carried along by the waves of His grace. He makes some big waves of grace and big waves of mercy, and I'm just so thankful that we have that opportunity to be a family and experience what that means together. You don't want to miss next week, and I'm not going to tell you why. But you don't want to miss it because there's going to be a celebration, okay? So don't miss next week, just telling you. Okay, we're in week 13 of the story, and I'm going to start out with something really sad. But I think it's important. It's a story about a guy who came walking into an emergency room. Some strangers brought him into an emergency room. His throat was cut. He'd been hit on the head really hard. They tried to ascertain what was wrong with him. He had this massive head injury from something hitting him or he hitting something else, and this tear in his neck, and he was completely out of it. He reeked of alcohol. He'd been drinking profusely. He was in tattered clothes, definitely a bum, a derelict, and so he was kind of pushed off to the side in this New York City hospital. And eventually someone got to him and they sewed up his neck, but he never really recovered from that. And he just kept asking everybody to bring him a drink. Bring me a drink. Can I have a drink? Do you have some money for a drink? And they put him back in the back of a ward, and 3 days later he died. They took his body down to the morgue and they put a toe tag on his big toe, and it just said John Doe. And a couple of days after that, one of his drinking buddies tracked down the fact that he had been taken to that hospital. You see, what had happened is in a drunken stupor at a bus station, he fell in the men's bathroom. He knocked over a porcelain sink, and he hit his head on that porcelain sink, and that's what caused it to fall over, and it broke. And one of the shards of that porcelain got a hold of his neck and cut his neck open. And it wasn't the neck injury that killed him, it was the brain injury that killed him. And they had tried to figure out who he was. All he had on was a tattered coat, had 76 cents in the pocket, and had a little note, a little scrap of paper. And all it said on the scrap of paper was, "Dear friends and gentle hearts." That was it. "Dear friends and gentle hearts." And they had tried to figure out who he was from that little line, and they couldn't. It sounded almost like a lyric from a song, but they had no idea who he was. He was only 38 years old. He looked twice that age. And it was this friend that tracked him down that was able to say who this man was. His name was Stephen Foster. He had written songs like Camptown Races, "Oh Susanna," "Jeannie with the light brown hair," "Way Down Upon the Swanee River," "Beautiful Dreamer," "Old Folks at Home," and 200 other songs that actually shaped the culture of a nation. And he'd written them only a few years before. Things that are rooted in our American heritage. And yet nobody knew this man. And nobody mourned this man who died alone. You know, that's a tragic story. But it's not a story that sits by itself. I could tell you the story of Howard Hughes, couldn't I? Or Marilyn Monroe, or Freddie Prinze, or Elvis Presley, or Natalie Wood, or John Belushi, or Lynn Bias, or Kurt Cobain, or Chris Farley, or Anna Nicole Smith, or Michael Jackson, or Whitney Houston. And the list could go on and on and on. People who died as victims of suicide, or people who died as victims of alcohol and drug abuse. You know, there are a lot of other stories that are out there today that maybe didn't end in suicide or death, but the people that live those lives are just shells of the people that they used to be. People like O.J. Simpson or Mike Tyson or Courtney Love or Elliot Spitzer or Bernie Madoff or Marion Jones or Barry Bonds, Tanya Harding, Lindsay Lohan, Jonathan Edwards. What happened to them? Well, they didn't take their own life or die, but their story, their life story is just as tragic. And you know what's sadder still is that there are literally millions of people that have the same kind of story in their life. It's a story that starts out pretty good, maybe even great, and then they've experienced some sort of defeat and futility. You don't hear about them. I mean, they're not famous. They don't make the headlines. Maybe their lives don't end in suicide, but they're trying to escape that same dissatisfaction in life. Never understand what it means to have that sense of victory, that joy, the fulfillment that God wants all of his people to have, and they aren't going to have it. They begin the day maybe the same way that a person named Willie Loman does, and he's the main character of Arthur Miller's play called Death of a Salesman. And some of you may have seen that or heard of that. But what this man does is he gets up every morning, he drops his head into his hands, and he mutters these words: I have got to get up and live today, but I have forgotten why. Week 13 of the story is about a man named Solomon. He's a man who had it all. He had everything. You know, I've heard it said before that the man who dies with the most toys wins. I'm going to change that. The guy who dies with the most toys is dead, okay? And somebody else gets his toys. But I think that if you were to say, who would be that guy who died with the most toys? Who is the guy that, quote unquote, won? It would have to be this guy. It would have to be Solomon. I don't know anybody that's ever lived that was more affluent than this guy, who was more powerful. I mean, he had everything, no matter what the category was, he won. Whether it was power, whether it was intellect, whether it was finance, whether it was career, I don't think it really matters what title or what heading you put on it. This was the guy who won everything. And yet, Solomon's story is actually a tragic story. And if you've been reading through your reading plan for the story, you know this. Because when we look at Solomon, sometimes we kind of look at the beginning of his life, because he started out awesome. He started out great, but something happened, and that's what I want us to capture. I want us to capture that, because if we can learn this, maybe we don't have to go down the same road, okay? We've talked about people who struggle in life, who have difficulties in life and rise above it. But with Solomon, what you're seeing is a guy who has every break. He gets everything, and he just slowly fritters it away until it's all gone. Now, when I say it's all gone, I mean, he still died a wealthy man. He still died a powerful man, very well-connected man. But that didn't matter. It was still all gone. All gone. You know, his father is the one that we've been discussing the last 2 weeks. His name was David, and he reigned over Israel for 40 years. And he had his high points, and he has his low points. But he was a man that was always running after God's heart. Even when he was in his low points, he was running after God's heart. And he still wanted that to be reflected in his son Solomon. And we read some of the last words of David in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. I'm going to read that for you. You might want to read along. And I want you to hear the heart of David as he's looking at the very end of his life and he's trying to commission his son. It says, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave charge to Solomon, his son. I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong and show yourself a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements, as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul. You will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. This is beautiful because you remember what I told you about Joshua? Of all the good things that Joshua did, this is one thing that's missing from his resume, because Moses raised up Joshua. You remember that? He told him to be strong and courageous, and then God moved after that, and he told Joshua to be strong and courageous. And remember, Joshua leaves his part of the leadership of Israel by saying, choose for yourself this day whom you're going to serve, whether it's the gods of the place that God delivered you from in Egypt, or the gods of the people that live around you, but it's for me and my house. We'll serve the Lord. And we look at that as a great statement, but it's actually a statement that's missing something. What it's missing is this: choose for yourselves. Because that's exactly what they ended up doing. Remember Judges 21:25 that said there was no king in Israel in those days, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They chose for themselves. One thing Joshua didn't do was he didn't appoint and raise up a person to succeed him. And one thing that we see over and over in the story of the Judges is they didn't raise up people to succeed them. And when we get to Saul, God is establishing Saul through Samuel. But then Saul, he disconnects from the throne because of his unfaithfulness to God. And Samuel is told by God to go and anoint David. Now look what David's doing. David's doing exactly what he should be doing. He's raising up someone to come after him. Someone that he's discipled, someone that he's raised up. That's going to be an effective leader. And you see that David's saying, it's not just about you. This is about what the promise that God made to me and all my descendants. And you're the first one. You're that one of those descendants. So that was the burden that was on Solomon, to follow in the footsteps of his father David in his 40-year reign. So how is Solomon going to manage this new reign? Well, let's go to the 3rd chapter, just a page over, 1 Kings chapter 3, and let's read about what Solomon does. It starts in verse 3, goes to verse 14. It says, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Wow. Solomon answered, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You've continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne to this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I'm only a little child and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you've chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. Remember when we talked about moral absolutes? Remember that? And what is David doing? He's saying, I want you to be my moral absolute. I want you to be the one who determines what's right and wrong, not me. For who is able to govern this great people of yours. Can you hear his humility? The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, so God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Wow. Did he just hit the jackpot or what? Talk about the right answer. Ding, 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 ding. That's amazing. Does Solomon get off to a good start? Does he ever get off to a good start? He literally becomes the wisest man on the face of the earth. He was so wise that people came from all over the earth just to hear what he had to say. The Queen of Sheba came and was so overwhelmed with his wisdom and with his wealth. This is what she said: the half has not been told. The half has not been told. In other words, it's lost to you and me half of how great this man was. Solomon was greater in riches and in wisdom than all the other kings on the earth. The entire world sought an audience for him. Year after year, everyone that came from all over the world would bring gifts, articles of gold and silver and weapons and robes and spices and horses and mules and sheep and cattle. And so Solomon started growing, and not just in wisdom, but in wealth. And when you read the Proverbs of Solomon, you're reading all sorts of practical wisdom. I mean, it's just wisdom on top of wisdom on top of wisdom. And that practical wisdom can do amazing things when it comes to winning friends and influencing people. Just incredible things. Just think about if Solomon lived today. Where would you be seeing him? Where would he be interviewed? Would he be on the cover of GQ? Solomon. People Magazine, Forbes, Fortune, USA Today, Wall Street Journal. Everybody would be wanting to know what Solomon has to say. But something happened to this guy. Something happened to him. You know, God warned him. He said, listen, Solomon, I've given you all this wisdom. And here are 3 things I really don't want you to do. I don't want you to store up for yourself a lot of silver and gold. I don't want you to store up for yourself a lot of horses. And I don't want you to store up for yourself a lot of different women. Now, what is Solomon known for? What is Solomon known for above all things? 3 things. Solomon's mines, right? Solomon's stables, and Solomon's women, right? Was it 700 wives and 300 concubines? Or was it 700 concubines and 300 wives? I don't know. A lot of women. That means if he saw one woman every evening, he wouldn't see the same woman for 3 years. I can't even wrap my head around that. One woman's all I can handle. And I can't even handle that. Amen? Amen. All right. So even though he knew the right thing to do, he didn't follow it. Oh. Is that true for us? Are there ever times when we really know the right thing to do, we just decide not to do it? Yeah, there's a disconnect sometimes between what wisdom says and what wisdom does. Because wisdom sometimes doesn't do what it ought to do. And Solomon was horrible when it came to actually living out what he taught other people. You know, when I look at Solomon's life and you read it over this long haul, you see this erosion that takes place. I don't know what you call it. You might call it burnout. You might call it midlife crisis, losing your way, losing your focus, losing your purpose, losing your contentment. I'll tell you what it is. Let's put it in the context of the story. He got lost. Where? In the lower story. He got lost in the lower story. But I'll tell you what, the way he gets lost in the lower story is very unique, and it's something that we need to understand, because when we've been talking about getting lost in the lower story up to this point, it's usually people that are in the middle of a hard life, right? If we're talking about like Ruth and Naomi, we're talking about a hard life. We're talking about Joseph, we're talking about a hard life. I mean, he gets sold into slavery by his brothers. And then he ends up being in the dungeon, because he's falsely accused by his owner. I mean, there's things like that happen. The husbands die. Ruth's husband and Naomi's husband, and they come back and they don't have anything. We usually hear about being in the lower story because of bad circumstances. And this is where Solomon really can capture us, because that's not what happens to him. He doesn't have bad circumstances. Everything in his life is good. So what in the world is happening when a man starts getting involved in gross immorality, in drunkenness, in idolatry, in extravagance, and a complete loss of personal direction? How in the world does this happen? Because Solomon has it all. How does that happen? How could the wisest man who ever lived do something so dumb? The book of Ecclesiastes is a book that Solomon wrote toward the end of his life. And the book of Ecclesiastes is a great book to read, because it helps you to reflect on Solomon as he reflects on his own life. And what it does is it gives you insight into his problem. Let's read Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 2 to 9, because it's kind of the statement of the problem. Verse 2, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does a man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south, it turns to the north, round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome. More than one can say. An eye has never enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And what begins there is a man who reviews his life and searches the futility of it. And so he looks at every single component, everything he's chased after, everything he's been blessed with, and what it's brought him. And he has to go back over and over again and say the same thing: meaningless. Like a man searching to fill something, like trying to fill a bucket with water with no bottom in it. He just can't do it. And every time he tries, it finds he's just meaningless again. So why such a negative, cynical view of life? Why is his joy gone? Why has happiness eluded him? And what can we learn from it? Here it is. Would you agree that Solomon was blessed? How many agree with me? Raise your hands, all of our locations, that Solomon was blessed. What excuse do we have when we've been blessed to be unhappy and to not have any joy or have any fulfillment in life? How can this happen? See why this is different? Most people get caught in the lower story, or at least up to this point, when we've studied people, they get caught up in the lower story because of bad things happen in their life. But what's happening with Solomon is a whole lot of good things are happening in his life. And so we can call them blessings. He's being blessed like mad. He's being buried in his blessings, right? So why is he in the lower story? I'll tell you why. Here it is. Blessings become distractions when they are not lived out for the glory of God. That's it. Blessings become distractions when they are not lived out for the glory of God. Every blessing God gives you is designed to be reflected back to Him and out to other people. And if all you are is a person who soaks it in, eventually you're going to stink and rot. You get a sponge, you fill it full of water, put it under your sink and leave it there. Oh, yeah, oh. Why? What's going to happen? I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to throw it away. You're going to smell it. And then you're going to get rid of it because you can't fix that. Right? What's a sponge designed to do? Two things. Number one, come on, you intelligent engineers. Number one, a sponge is designed to soak things up. Is that it? No. What else is a sponge designed to do? Squeeze them out, right? So when God gives us a blessing, what are we supposed to do? Soak it up and then just hold it. Just hold it. Oh, this is really good. No. Soak it up and squeeze it out. Back to the Lord and out to your brother and sister. Soak it up, squeeze it out, just like that. That's what you are designed to do. But if a blessing becomes a distraction, then that won't happen. And when it all started coming to Solomon, and Solomon started believing his own press, all that God had given him to bless him became the very thing that ruined him. Who would have thought? How many of you said, oh God, if I could just meet the right person. God, if you just put the right person in my life, that would be so great. God, if I just made a little more money. God, just fill in the blank, right? Maybe the problem, oh, you're not going to want to hear this. Maybe the problem isn't what's going on around you. Maybe the problem is what's going on inside of you. Maybe the problem with Solomon wasn't what was going on around him. It was what was going on inside of him. Because everything that God gave him was designed to be a reflection, to go right back to him and out to the world around him. But it became a distraction. You've all heard of Ernest Hemingway. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And he was also a pessimist. I don't think there was anything that he wrote that wasn't very pessimistic. You know, the last book that he wrote was a book called The Old Man and the Sea. You may have had to read that when you were in high school. But, you know, it's a really pessimistic story. And it ends up just hopeless. And you know, as soon as Ernest Hemingway finished that novel, he took off his shoes and his socks. He got a shotgun. He put his big toe in the trigger guard and put the barrel in his mouth and blew his head off. And you know what he said? He wrote a suicide note. You know what it said on the suicide note? The farce is over. You know what? Ernest Hemingway had everything. Or did he? Solomon had everything. Had it all. Or did he? Maybe he didn't. Rick Warren, in The Purpose-Driven Life, says these words. He begins the book with these words. It's not about you. The purpose of your life is far greater than your own personal fulfillment, your peace of mind, or even your happiness. It's far greater than your family, your career, or even your wildest dreams and ambitions. If you want to know why you were placed on this planet, you must begin with God. You were born by his purpose and for his purpose. The search for the purpose of life has puzzled people for thousands of years. That's because typically we begin at the wrong starting point ourselves. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about God. And when we get that out of place, just like Solomon, we lose our focus, life gets messy, and even if we start well, we can finish poorly because we get lost in the lower story because we're distracted. We forget where our blessings came from and where they need to go. With Solomon, it was intellectualism, pleasure, liquor, materialism, sex, power, laughter, career. All of these things were part of his lower story. But they only become part of the upper story when we are using them for the glory of God. I want to turn to one last passage in Ecclesiastes. It's in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And this is after he finishes, but it's still a pessimistic, even fatalistic statement. Verse 13 and 14 of chapter 12 says this: "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." Well, that's true. But it's still cynical, isn't it? It's still cynical. Solomon ended his life with everything and with nothing. Depending upon your point of view, everything and nothing. You see, he looked up from his mountain of meaningless stuff and he searched for something greater. He searched for an answer that made life worth living, an answer that gave meaning to life. And he never found it. You know, the answer to the meaning of life is a name. And it is the answer to every question. And it's a name that you know. And I believe that Solomon, in all of his wisdom, and in all of his money, and all of his power, and all of his majesty and pomp and circumstance, would have given every bit of it away if he could have heard one name. And that name is what? That name is what? Because his name is the answer to every question. We're moving to a time of decision.